Hello dear students and welcome to a lecture on food chain and food web. In today's lecture, we shall be talking about food chain, trophic levels, ecological efficiencies, members of a food chain length, food web, and finally, we shall highlight the significance of food chains and food webs. To begin with, let me give you a brief introduction of food chain. Living organisms and their non-living environment are inseparably interrelated and interact with each other. Any unit that includes all the organisms interacting with the physical environment so that a flow of energy leads to clearly defined trophic structure, biotic diversity, and material cycles within the system is an ecological system or ecosystem. Organisms at or near the surface of Earth are immersed in a radiation environment consisting of solar radiation and long-wave thermal radiation flux from nearby surfaces. Both contribute to the climatic environment, but only a small fraction of the solar radiation can be converted to provide energy for the biotic components of the ecosystem. In an ecosystem, plants capture the sun's energy and use it to convert inorganic compounds into energy-rich organic compounds. This process of using the sun's energy to convert minerals in the soil into green leaves is called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is only the beginning of a chain of energy convergence. There are many types of animals that will eat the products of the photosynthesis process. For example, deer eating shrub leaves, rabbits eating carrots, or worms eating grass. When these animals eat these plant products, food energy and the organic compounds are transferred from plants to the animals. These animals are in turn eaten by other animals, again transferring energy and organic compounds from one animal to another. Examples would be lions eating deer, foxes eating rabbits, or birds eating worms. The transfer of food energy from the source in plants through a series of organisms with repeated eating and being eaten is referred to as food chain. Food chain is formed by a series of organisms arranged in a linear manner through their feeding habits. In this chain, each type of organism feeds on the type below it in the series. A food chain is an energy sequence of links or trophic levels that start with the species that eats no other species and ends with a species that's eaten by no other species. At each transfer, a large proportion, 80 to 90% of the potential energy is lost as heat. Therefore, the number of steps or links in a sequence is limited, usually to 4 or 5. The shorter the food chain, the greater the available energy. Food chains were first introduced by the African Arab scientist and philosopher Al-Jahiz in the 9th century and later popularized in the book published in 1927 by Charles Elton, which also introduced the food web concept. This chain of transfer of energy from one species to another can continue several more times, but it eventually ends. It ends with the dead animals that are broken down and used as food or nutrition by bacteria and fungi. As these organisms, referred to as decomposers, feed from the dead animals, they break down the complex organic compounds into simple nutrients. Decomposers play a very important role in this world because they take care of breaking down many dead materials. There are more than 1 lakh different types of decomposer organisms. These simpler nutrients are returned to the soil and can be used again by the plants. The energy transformation chain starts all over again. Food chains are directional link paths of trophic energy or equivalently sequence of links that start with basal species such as producers or fine organic matter and end with the consumer organisms. Dear students, let's move on to the trophic level. Positions of organisms along the food chains are called trophic levels. and various species which obtain food energy by the same number of steps from the sun are called members of same trophic level. Thus, all green plants belong to the first trophic level, plant eaters to the second trophic level, animal eaters to the third trophic level, and so on. The highest carnivore in the food chain is known as top predator. Connections involving feeding are known as trophic connections. Trophic levels provide the framework for studying ecological energetic and efficiencies as well as for studying cascading trophic interactions. Energy available for each trophic level is partitioned in number of ways. Part of the energy is ingested and part is left unutilized. A portion of the ingested energy is assimilated and the remaining is lost as ingested or fecal matter. The assimilated energy is partitioned into production and respiration. Further, a portion of the production can be stored for reuse at a later time, and another portion can be exuded or excreted. The remaining portion of the energy is utilized in the growth of biomass and is available for the next trophic level. Thus, because of the losses, the energy available to the succeeding trophic levels decreases. This is in accord with the second law of thermodynamics, which states that each energy transfer is accompanied by dispersion of energy into unavailable form. However, if all the losses are summed, the energy input balances energy output. Now comes the term ecological efficiencies. Ratios between energy flow at different points along the food chain when expressed as percentages are called as ecological efficiencies. In general, the production efficiency at primary producer level is between 1 and 5%. The production efficiencies between secondary trophic level vary between 10 and 20%. Moving on to the next part of the lecture, that's members of a food chain. First of all comes the producers. Producers are organisms that are able to create their own food through photosynthesis. They are at the lowest part of energy pyramid. They are also called autotrophs. Producers convert inorganic compounds into organic compounds. Then the second one is consumers. Consumers are organisms of an ecological food chain that receive their energy by consuming other organisms. These organisms are formerly referred to as heterotrophs, which include animals, bacteria, and fungus. Such organisms may consume by various means, including predation, parasitization, and biodegradation. There are different levels of consumers. Those that feed directly from producers, that is, organisms that eat plant or plant products, are called primary consumers. Grasshopper is a primary consumer. Then organisms that feed on primary consumers are called secondary consumers, and those which feed on secondary consumers are tertiary consumers. Consumers are also classified depending on what they eat. Number 1 is herbivores. Herbivores are those that eat only plants or plant products. For example, grasshoppers, mice, rabbits, deer, moose, cows, etc. The second category is carnivores. Carnivores, on the other hand, are those that eat only other animals. For example, foxes, frogs, and snakes. The third category is omnivores. Omnivores are the last type and eat both plants and meat. For example, bears. They eat insects, fish, moose, etc. Second example is turtles. They eat snails, crayfish, crickets, earthworms, but also lettuce, small plants, and algae. Third example of omnivores is monkeys. They eat frogs and lizards, as well as fruits, flowers, and leaves. Then comes the next term, food chain length. Food chain length is a continuous variable that provides a measure of the passage of energy and an index of ecological structure that increases in value, counting progressively through the linkages in a linear fashion from the lowest to the highest trophic levels. Food chains vary in length from 3 to 6 or more levels. A food chain consisting of a flower, a frog, a snake, and an owl consists of 4 levels, whereas a food chain consisting of grass, a grasshopper, a rat, a snake, and finally a hawk consists of 5 levels. Then comes the types of food chains. In nature, we generally distinguish 3 different kinds of food chains. The number 1 is grazing food chain. This type of food chain starts from the living green plants, goes to the grazing herbivores, and on to the carnivores. Ecosystems with such type of food chain are directly dependent on an influx of solar radiations. This type of chain thus depends on autotrophic energy capture and the movement of this captured energy to herbivore. Most of the ecosystems in nature follow this type of food chain. From energy standpoint, these chains are very important. The phytoplankton, zooplankton, fish sequence, or the grass, rabbit, fox sequence are the examples of grazing food chain. The second type of food chain is detritus food chain. This type of food chain goes from dead organic matter into microorganisms and then to organisms feeding on detritus and their predators. Such ecosystems are thus less dependent on direct solar energy. These depend chiefly on the influx of organic matter produced in another system. For example, such type of food chain operates in the decomposing accumulated litter in a temperate forest. The third type of food chain is parasitic food chain. Besides the main food chain pathways, a parasitic food chain may operate in many ecosystems, although the food energy passing through it may not be considerable. Plant parasitic nematodes may consume a portion of the net primary production in grassland ecosystems. A parasitic food chain involves host parasite hyperparasite links. Now, moving on to the next segment of our topic, that's food web. Few ecosystems are so simple that they are characterized by a single unbranched food chain. Several types of primary consumers usually feed on the same plant species. For example, one may find several insect types feeding on one tree and some vertebrate grazers. Also, any species of primary consumer usually eats several different plants. Such branching of food chains occur at other trophic levels as well. For instance, frogs eat several different types of insect species, which also may be eaten by different types of birds. Owls may eat primary consumers such as field mice and also prey on higher level organisms like snakes. It's more correct, then, to draw relationships between these plants and animals not as a simple chain but as a more elaborate interwoven food web. The term food web has its origin from Elton's food cycles, which describe the patterns of which species eats what other species in a community. Now, let's talk about the types of food web. According to Panay, there are 3 types of food webs. Number 1. Connectedness webs. These are based on the concept who eats whom, emphasizing the feeding relationships. These are also known as topological food webs. The second one is energy flow food webs. In this type of food webs, energy flow through the food web is estimated. The connections between populations are quantified by the flux of energy between a source and its consumer. The third type of the food web is the functional food webs. Panay developed The idea of functional food webs on the basis of the impact of species on the structure of community. Food webs have also been described as source webs, sink webs, and community webs. Let's take the source webs. The source webs refer to one or more kinds of organisms and organisms that eat them, their predators, and so on. Then sink webs. These refer to one or more kinds of organisms, the organisms they eat, their other prey, and so on. Community webs. These are group of species within a defined area or habitat. Most food web theories employ these webs. Dear friends, let's move on to the significance of food chains and food webs. Food chains help understand feeding relationships and the interaction between organisms in any ecosystem. They also help us comprehend the energy flow mechanism and matter circulation in ecosystems and understand the movement of toxic substances in the ecosystem and problem of biological magnification. Food web study provides information on biological diversity in an ecosystem also. Dear students, before I conclude, here is a summary of today's deliberation. Food chains and food webs are methods of explaining an ecosystem because it describes how energy flows from one species to another. Food chains and food webs describe the successive transfer of energy from plants to the animals that eat them, and to the animals that eat those animals, and so on. A food chain is a model for this process which assumes that transfer of energy within the community is relatively simple. A food chain in grassland ecosystem, for example, might be insect eat grass, mice eat insects, and fox eat mice. But such an outline is not exactly accurate, and many more species of plants and animals are actually involved in the transfer of energy. Rodents often feed on both plants and insects, and some animals, such as predatory birds, feed on several kinds of rodents. This description of the way energy flows through an ecosystem is called a food web. Food webs can be thought of as interconnected or intersecting food chains. That was all about the food chains and food webs. Thank you for being with me.